If you would like to support the Likeville podcast, you can like us on iTunes. That's a good thing. You can share our podcasts with your friends and enemies even. And if you'd like to support us in a more material way, you can become a Patreon supporter of Likeville. All right. Welcome to the Likeville podcast. This is John Faithful Hamer. Today we're going to be talking with film critic Matthew Hayes. Welcome, Matthew.
Thanks for having me.
Matthew teaches at Concordia and Marianopolis in film studies, and he's also has a special place in my heart because when I was in undergrad, I remember all my friends, we read Matthew Hayes had a regular sort of film criticism in this much missed a newspaper called the Montreal Mirror, which is now gone, and we remember it wistfully. And I really hope one day, are you going to at some point make a book out of those articles? I asked you about this years ago, and it still hasn't happened.
Funny you should ask that. I mean, I actually approached because the Québécois, the corporation that owned the Mirror and eventually shut it, they eventually, after a couple of months after the paper was shut, they, I think, realized that the website was still up. So they took it down, which effectively removed about 15 years of my work from the public record in terms of easily being able to access, like if I was teaching psycho, I could send my students a link to the Janet Leigh interview that I did where we talked about working, making psycho and working with Hitchcock and all these really interesting things, discussions I'd had with her. Or when we taught Texas Chainsaw Massacre, I could send them the link to one of the cast members I did an interview with where we talked about making that film.
And they were so good. I mean, they were such good articles.
Wow, that's very kind of you. But it was really fun to have all that stuff. And so I actually approached a couple of local publishers and said, what about collecting a lot of my best interviews? And they said that those, there's a couple of reasons. One is they said that those anthologies tend not to sell very well. What's number one? Like a lot of books in Canada or anywhere. But also they said that with Canadian publishing, they function a lot on grants, and you need to be producing new material for grants. So if I were just to republish a lot of my interviews, but I will do that one day because I want to do that really badly. There's enough work that I've got from magazines and newspapers as well as beyond the Mirror interviews that I did that I'm really proud of that I'd like to see, collected. I did 10 years ago a book of new interviews, but it was a culmination of a lot of my work, both for the Mirror and Popular Press and for the Advocate in the United States, but also my academic work because I was finishing up my master's. And it had been my master's thesis project, which was a collection of interviews with queer filmmakers. So that did really well. I got an award in the States, and I was very proud of it. And so now I'm working on an anthology of interviews with documentary filmmakers. So that's kind of the next thing I'm working on right now.
Okay, that's really.
But I do really miss the Mirror, and I still have trouble making sense of the city without it. Even though, and the other thing that's really too bad about losing the Mirror is when I did when I used to teach a journalism class. I just taught alternative journalism at Concordia this past semester, which was really interesting. But whenever I would teach a feature writing class or any kind of writing class, I would get the students to come up with ideas and pitch them. And then I would have Alistair or whoever the editor was in to meet with the students. And often he liked their ideas. And so a lot of times I could help the students get their first publication. And sometimes it would even be a cover story. So they got a few $100 and they got a cover story and they were very excited about it. And it was fun it was kind of a gateway drug for a lot of young journalists. And now I think the city has really lost something without weeklies. I mean, we sort of seemed to have too many for a while. There was two competing. The Mirror bought up by Quebec when they started EC to go up against Voir an Hour. So we had 4 weeklies in a city that we didn't really have the advertising market to actually support it. But I think we are really at a loss without those weeklies. And corporate ownership really wasn't good for the weeklies. I mean, the Georgia Strait in Vancouver is still going, now is still going in Toronto, and they're independently owned. So I think that the independently owned weeklies worked a lot better than corporate ownership. Hasn't been good for the media at all.
Yeah, it's interesting because one of the questions I want to ask you about all of this is that how have things changed, not just in terms of journalism? Because I saw this thing where Chomsky said in an interview, he said, I fear that maybe one of the unintended consequences of media studies has been Fox News and everything that's happening. That we were constantly telling everybody that it's all propaganda.
Absolutely.
And we had no idea what real propaganda would look like.
Absolutely. I mean, the thing that the mantra that I heard in grad school in the 90s over and over and over again was there is no essential truth.
Yes.
There was all this postmodern theory. And I've thought about this a lot, is that and then we were told, well, there's not one real true story, that everyone has a different truth. And some Republicans got together with Rupert Murdoch and said, we're never going to win this. We're never going to win it. We're always going to have a media that's biased against us. It's too critical of the right. Most journalists are liberal. Most journalists are agnostic. We need to have a network we need to have news that is really going to be slanted in our direction.
Yeah.
And, nothing like an Australian billionaire on your side. I mean, they just shoveled money into this, and it's muddied the waters significantly. And now I think it's what we're seeing. I mean, this is the first Facebook president, the first Twitter president, the first social media, and the first Fox News president. I mean, Fox News, we see now he's tweeting pretty much what anyone's saying on Fox and Friends, which is this sort of incredibly foolish group of people on this panel who are just really kind of idiots, really. And they're just, anything that they're saying, he's responding to. I mean, it's very alarming.
Yeah. And so now, but it's funny because all the people that came of age like us during this time when it was all about how this was considered kind of cutting edge analysis. And I don't think anybody, if you thought NBC and ABC were slanted in this, whatever neoliberal way, however they spun it, it's really nothing. Now people are saying, oh, there's all this sort of wistful, like, longing for, can we have them back?
Well, I remember in Harper's must have been the late 80s or early 90s, there was an article called Blab Scam, and it was about how biased Nightline was under Ted Koppel, that their guests skewed to the right. And now, just pining for Ted Koppel. I mean, he was such an excellent interviewer and somebody who believed, in facts, that we could actually have facts, that there were certain facts we could agree upon. And the other thing that's happened with all these, with Fox doing so much commentary and shows like The View, and which guilty pleasure, I watch it, mainly just because Joy Behar occasionally says something funny. But there's been this conflation, this ongoing conflation of facts and opinions, which allows people to talk about alternative facts and to talk about, well, you have your facts and I have mine, you have your opinion and I have mine, as if those things are all just one thing. And I find that interesting. But it's kind of it's really become quite dystopic. All of this, all the theory that we were talking about, it just got picked up by the right and they ran with it, and they've just created their own alternative reality where, guns aren't really a problem, and and there are transgender people lurking in washrooms waiting to accost children, and they've just created these stories out of whole cloth that are narratives that are now shaping the laws around us, and it's, well, particularly in the United States, it's really, really alarming.
And there's another trend from the 1990s which has gone in a direction that I personally never anticipated that it would go in that direction. I think you did, because I remember reading a number of your reviews where you specifically, thank you, where you specifically talked about the limits of irony as a way of sort of approaching the world and approaching kind of ideas and politics. But you were one of the only people that I heard that did that. So basically there was this attitude, and to some extent you see it in punk, you see it in this reaction against the hippies, the idealism of that this was, ridiculous, and we're going to be kind of outside and kind of very snide and looking down on people who believe in, big ideas. And this was, generally speaking, I think, something that was from people who were coming from the left, usually, right? And I don't think what they realized, and you see this with Vice magazine, that was coming to life just when you were writing for the Mirror, when, all that stuff in the 90s, Vice magazine was starting here in Montreal. And now you look at, quite a few of those people who started with Vice were voting for Trump and were Trump supporters. And actually it's consistent with the attitude they had, because they just like watching everything burn. It's like they like kind of shaking things up, and that's fun for them, right? I mean, what do you think about that?
Well, I think it's interesting. Certainly, they had the very famous, notorious riff with Gavin McInnes after he started saying really racially out there things, flagrantly throwing the N-word around and other things like that. And of course, recently,
you remember he was doing that when he was coked out at parties in Montreal in the 90s.
Yeah, no,
he loved to be. He was provocative.
Yeah,
he was basically what's his name? Milo. He was Milo. He was like a straight Milo in the 90s.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I still remember bumping into him at a Halloween party, and he said, "I'm dressed up as the AIDS guy," and he thought that was really side-splittingly hilarious. He did things like that. He was, but I always found him to be. I mean, I haven't seen him in a long time. I always found him to be a pretty, sort of seemed like a decent fellow to me. Something happened to him when he went down there. Too much Fox News, but it's interesting to see them reposition their brand, because in the last sort of 5 to 7 years, they've, instead of just putting a pair of tits on the cover and saying, well, a sponsor gave us some money, so here we're putting a nude woman on the cover. They've now trying to reposition. They've effectively repositioned themselves as a kind of guardian sensibility, like very left wing, very politically correct, and on the major issues of the day, right? And at Charlottesville, taking on the Nazis and all that sort of thing. And so they've had to, because of their...
Which is just another kind of pornography.
Yeah.
I mean, they'll show dead babies now, right?
Yeah.
And which is also just trying to appeal to people in a very guttural way, right?
But they had really picked up on, I think, on the spirit, frankly, of the Mirror, which was kind of an anything goes, let's be sensational. If it bleeds, it leads. If it's tits, if it's got tits, it fits. Kind of sensibility.
I've never heard that.
Kind of sensibility, and then they spun that for a long time, and of course, lad culture, the lad magazines in Britain. So they were playing on a lot of that. Like, we don't care. It was a fuck you to second wave feminists for sure. And now that second wave feminism has come back into vogue with the Me Too movement, they just had a shuffle where they've put a woman in charge, and they've kind of apologized for these, gotten rid of some guys who were acting inappropriately with women, sexually harassing women. So it's just interesting to see how they're realigning themselves in these times. We'll see. The battle lines are being drawn.
Yeah. I mean, I see it as a continuation of that, the kind of piss off the bourgeoisie, the modernist idea of, like, as long as you're pissing off the bourgeoisie and you're scandalizing them, then you must be doing something right. And I see that spirit has carried over into what Gavin is doing now in a lot of his projects. And it's also a general thing you can see among a lot of people that are sort of alt-right, where they, I'll ask them, I say, look, Trump has stabbed you in the fucking back, like, on so many things that you said you liked about him. Yeah. He's gone back on that. He hasn't drained the swamp. He hasn't actually reined in America's sort of presence overseas, the whole idea of America first. We're not going to try and be the world's policeman anymore. All these things that you said you were voting for, he hasn't actually done. And the response I get from them almost all the time, from my friends and family members who are Trump supporters in the States, is they say, well, you know what? He's still pissing off liberals, right? Which is how David Frum of Axis of Evil fame, Canadian, David Frum, in his recent book Trumpocracy, which is very, very good, by the way. In Trumpocracy, he says basically much of conservatism now is just fuck you leftists.
Yeah.
Like, that's his exact frame.
And Michael Moore said it too.
Yeah.
Right.
And so, but I see that as actually being, in a way, a connection to this punk irony attitude, which is that we're always going against whatever the mainstream is. And I don't think people realized, I mean, I saw you mentioned this in your articles a number of times. I know Martha Nussbaum was also sort of, waving a flag saying, watch out, this is actually, if you don't define what being subversive is more carefully, then ripping down the posters for the campus gay and lesbian sort of meeting center is subversive. That basically whatever happens to be popular at the moment, that whatever people care about, because Gavin McInnes, if you watch him, his whole sort of shtick seems to boil down to I make fun of people who care about shit, any shit.
Yeah.
Like if people are earnest and they get sort of fired up and they care about something genuinely, then I'm going to make fun of you. So, and that's the constant refrain. And I just don't think a lot of people realized how easily that could be used for anything.
I completely agree. I mean, each generation has its own sense of what is revolutionary or rebellious, but we have to keep in mind that the people who Trump appealed to overwhelmingly were older people. So we can look at demographics. We can see also that this repeated discussion of the white working class wasn't really true. Most of the working class voters actually favored Hillary over Trump. But when I pored over all the data after the wake of the election, because I was frankly pretty shocked. I think like most people, I really thought that Hillary Clinton was going to be the president. And she should have been really. The Electoral College is a scam. But when I poured over all the data, the chart that probably gave me the most hope was looking at how younger people were voting overwhelmingly for her. I mean, they could see through Trump, and they didn't buy into his faux rebellion. They knew he's just a pathological liar. And furthermore, all of the things he was saying about the environment, which he's following through with, reversing all the executive orders that Obama did about, and appointing someone in the head of the EPA, Pruitt, who is an avowed, wants to tear it apart. He said repeatedly in the past that he wanted to end the EPA. So, I mean, it's disaster capitalism, right? And but I think young people don't want that. I teach younger people at Concordia, but also much younger people at Marianopolis. 16 through 20 is the demographic there, and they're very woke. they know what this is about. They know what this is about. They don't have a problem with a gay teacher. They don't have a problem with LGBTQ youth. They don't have. They understand that multiculturalism is the only way forward in terms of how to have a policy that accepts and welcomes people from different places into a country. How are we ever going to go back to, what is this neo-nationalism? How are we going to go back to a lily white America? There's no way. I mean, you've got the fastest growing demographic are Latinos. That's not going to stop. You can ban Muslims at the border. You can deport people who came as children. You can do all that and look really inhumane, but it's not going to change the ethnic racial makeup of the United States. Mm-hmm. It's a fantasy. It really is. It's all been just a delusional fantasy.
What I think is interesting is, I mean, that the numbers totally bear out what you just said. In fact, this is something that they've looked at in terms of attitudes towards on racism, on kind of openness to people of various sexual orientations and all that stuff. It actually holds true that even in like many very, very red states, in very conservative areas, in right-wing areas in Canada and the United States, even there, young people overwhelmingly are fine with these things. I find that kind of fascinating because what it tells me is that because often they are fine with that sort of stuff, but not from a kind of principled political stance, but from a much more sort of knee-jerk, just emotional stance. And this is why, and I think the reason for this, my theory is I think that actually is because of movies and TV and popular culture, which shape, I mean, you look all the way back to Plato's Republic when they're talking about building this city and speech, this sort of totalitarian society. They specifically say they're going to kind of ban the poets, and they're going to ban because they understood very, very clearly that the storytellers have way more power than the priests, because they are the ones that sort of form what Martha Nussbaum calls the narrative imagination, right? So, and this is a way in which I actually think, paradoxically, the Christian right in the 1980s and the early 1990s, they were actually right when they were trying to ban depictions of gay characters on TV. They were actually seeing things very clearly. I would say Modern Family, that one show, has done more for gay rights in the United States than any of the movements, because what it's done is it's brought these characters, these completely kind of fascinating, interesting, totally human, believable characters into everybody's living room and made them members of the family and people they like. And that is so much more dangerous, than any kind of people marching in the street.
Absolutely. And Joe Biden even said when he was asked about supporting same-sex marriage, he mentioned Will and Grace. And said,
wow.
I watched that. So I completely agree, and it's one of the reasons why it's being a very political animal, it was hard to separate that from all the film reviewing and television reviewing that I was doing and talking about popular culture. And you can trace that culture war back a long way. I mean, the Victorians didn't like Freud, and the Puritans in the mid 20th century didn't like Alfred Kinsey and what he was saying and doing. And the Catholic League of Decency did not like it whenever a studio announced that they were adapting another Tennessee Williams play. And actually, you can look back at all of these film versions of Tennessee Williams plays that are so famous and see the way that sexual themes were reduced or became much more suggestive and less extreme, less overt, and became covert.
Oh, the classic is Streetcar Named Desire.
Streetcar Named Desire. I mean, there's that, but there's Cat in a Hot Tin Roof. There's Suddenly Last Summer. And there's, as you say, they were right. There's a good reason. If you start putting this stuff up on screen, these representations, and if you start reading about it and you start seeing it in popular media like film and television, it normalizes it. I mean, I even thought about this when I was watching Big Love, the series about the polygamists and Mormons, because as I watched that show, probably going into it, I thought, well, there's reasons we have laws against polygamy. Usually the cases that are brought to the courts are dubious ones where you've got, children being married, and it just looks like pedophilia. So it doesn't look great, and then child slavery and that kind of thing, sex slavery. But when you watch Big Love, by the end of the 5th season, I was like, if somebody wants to live like that, it's their business, right? I was the representation kind of changes things. And the smart thing about that show is that they didn't make fun. They took the people seriously. They took the polygamists at face value. So, and of course, they put Bill Paxton, a likable actor, as the central guy married to all these women. So I think that really does it. I mean, the other reason for the huge success of the LGBTQ movement is that unlike, say, race movements like the Black civil rights struggle, there usually are within a family, within an extended family, there's a gay uncle or a lesbian sister or something. Yeah. And so by the end of all that, at the end of the day, even in conservative families, people start to come out, and then people start to get more defensive when it's in their family. People shouldn't act that way. You shouldn't have to be within your family for somebody to respond. But once that happens, I mean, famously, Dick Cheney was asked,
I was just gonna say,
do you support the proposed amendment by President George W. Bush to ban same-sex, to make marriage between a man and a woman? And he said, I don't. And he brought up his daughter, and notably, it wasn't a journalist who asked. It was at a town hall meeting. It was a member of the public who asked him. Journalists felt afraid to ask certain questions. Well, they always do, but that was one that was seen out of the parameters of the polite to ask him about that, because they were talking about your lesbian daughter. Even though she was openly lesbian, she had a position at Coors, which was gay outreach, so she had a position. Her job title had it in it. But journalists were afraid to ask. So once that happens, and I think that's why we've seen such a huge shift. But I think you're right. I think it's also representations in the media. I think that's just dramatically changed things. To think that, there was an episode in, I think, 1973 or 74 of the Mary Tyler Moore Show where they had a character who happened to be gay, and and someone said he's gay, and it was a huge laugh line. It was a shocking thing that he was gay, and that they said that on network television. To think that was a big deal. I mean, now we're at such a different place, as you say, all these different shows. Of course, now with the other dystopic nightmare in the media is now, of course, we have the splintering of audiences. So you have all these Hallmark movies, holiday movies, and Trump supporters love them because they don't have any gay characters. There's no racial politics. There's certainly no trans characters. So you tune in.
I'm unfamiliar with what you're talking about.
Oh, these Hallmark Christmas movies? Oh, you haven't seen them? I've been posting about them on Facebook.
I've never even heard.
They're god awful. Then Hallmark is churning them out. They're these family-friendly movies
like
about
the
holiday.
Card maker.
Yeah.
They make movies now.
They make movies. And they're hugely popular with a certain demographic, guess who, in America. And so people can kind of just choose to watch what they want. It's like, part of our bubble is what media we choose to consume.
But do they actually have the kind of viewership? Because what I've always seen when they break this stuff down is that, first of all, red states on average consume way more pornography. Like internet companies have been saying this for years. They consume way more pornography on average than blue states. They have higher divorce rates on average than blue states. They have and also when it comes to, I think it was you. I think it was a review by you where you actually were talking about the numbers on this, and some of these shows that were quite scandalous and were pushing the envelope, like early HBO stuff. Mm-hmm. It was actually being consumed a great deal in these places. So I wonder if, maybe those Hallmark movies are doing well, but I suspect the kids are still watching reruns of 6 Feet Under.
We can hope. Yeah, we can hope. It's hard to know what anyone's viewing habits are.
Do you see a movie trailer? Do you have one in mind? Do you have like a particular?
No. Yeah. But the New York Times and the Washington Post had some pretty good analyses of these films and who they're popular with. And
wait a minute. Now something's ringing a bell. Is this with the guy who was on? He was the kid on Growing Pains, and he's become like a kind of an actor in kind of
those
Christian right movies. He's like a firefighter. And
those
stuff like
I've
that.
seen too. Those are very weird. But these are holiday films, and they produce more of them they produce like 30 or 40 of them a year because they're hugely popular with people. And I think they're actually on the Hallmark Channel, and basically they start with a budding romance, and then something threatens that romance. So by the end, they have to come together, and it has a happy resolution. And there just won't be any threatening stuff in them. They're going to be happy and sweet. And I think people like Mark Harmon and other actors
are
starring in it. Yeah. So they're pretty treacly. They're pretty dreadful, but they're kind of funny. And I've forgotten his name.
They're gonna turn campy like Rocky Horror. Somebody's gonna like.
So there's a writer in California who reviews every one he reviews, and posts his reviews on Facebook. I think his name is Michael Thomas Ford. No, he just reviews it, but tells it like it is. But it's actually pretty funny. Like he's taking each one kind of seriously, and it's like they're obviously just churning them out, and some computer software somewhere is writing them, right? So.
Well, one of the things I find interesting with the kind of the representation of gay characters in TV and movies is that, back in the day when you had like Will and Grace, everybody was like looking at his character with just very carefully trying to find fault with him. Like, that's a stereotype. He flames too much. That's not like, but now we have so many, we have characters on The Wire. We have, 6 Feet Under, these, sort of full red-blooded characters that are just very complicated, and they have a lot of stuff going on that now it's just not freighted that way. Yeah. So now, on Modern Family, right, you can have somebody who's like, flaming like a warm fire, and nobody cares because there's just so much diversity out there.
Yeah.
It's
and I think that's what I've called the weight of limited representation. If you only have one or two representations, then everyone...
I like that phrase, the weight of limited
representation.
That's a good line.
Yeah, and it's... I was talking about it, and I wrote that in Cineast because I was reviewing an anthology about Boys in the Band, which is a very controversial play come movie that was eventually a William Friedkin film in 1970. But it basically had this group of gay men who are very tormented and are sort of getting drunk and stoned in the course of an evening and are taunting each other and this is a sort of a birthday party that becomes really very dark. It's a sort of famous work of existential fiction, but it was very controversial when it came out. And Edward Albee just died, the existential playwright. He famously passed on producing it. He said this is the wrong time, right?
It's too hot.
It's too negative. It's too nasty. So. Ever since then,
I've never seen it.
The film is really worth seeing. And what's remarkable about it is that the cast from the play recreated their roles, and almost all of them were gay men playing gay men. So that was still unusual to this day. And it's a tremendous piece of work. It's devastating. It's very unhappy. So to this day, it's still a very complicated, polarizing piece of work, right? Because some people just don't want to see something that's that dark. In fact, they're going to do a Broadway revival of it with Zachary Quinto, I think, is going to be in it, coming up soon. So it's back. It'll be back in the news again. But now, as you're saying, now there's so much more that it's why it's funny. It's when I first heard this discussion that the character of Apu on The Simpsons was offensive. I was like, come on, it's The Simpsons. We've got everyone is skewered on the show. And, I would bring up Smithers and say, well, there's the gay character, but I think he's funny. But in thinking about it, Smithers is funny because in the 25 or 30 years that The Simpsons has been on the air, we've seen many more gay representations. So it's not such a big deal. And The Simpsons has been part of that with like parts for Harvey Fierstein and John Waters, and Scott Thompson doing gay characters. So, but we still don't really see many Indian representations. So for a lot of young people growing up, that they would be tormented, that they would be told, thank you, come again, the accent. And I was sort of saddened to hear that Hank Azaria does the voice of Apu was imitating Peter Sellers, who did one of the most famous representations
in the party.
In the party, that's where he got the accent from.
I had no idea.
Yeah, and I mean, I've talked to Indian actors who say, when we were growing up, that was really all we had. So, when Merchant Ivory Productions would call, we would look at the representation and say it's not perfect, but we got to get as many Indian representations as we can out there, even if it's not perfect, because we've got the party to go on. That's it, right?
Yeah.
It's Peter Sellers doing this horrible minstrel act, right?
Yeah.
So
it's not even good. That's the funny thing, because I grew up with a lot of South Asians, and so I knew I'm not very good at it anymore. But when I was a kid, I could like make fun of various different South Asian accents. Like I would just copy my friends' dads and stuff, and so I remember, and they would make fun of their dads, their voices, the way Sugar Sammy does and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But Peter's, the first time I saw the party, I thought, well, nobody sounds like that. Like that, that's not gonna make any South Asian kid laugh. Not because of the racism thing, just because you got it wrong.
That was the big New Year's movie. That was in Edmonton, I don't know if anywhere else, but the Princess Theatre, the Repertory Theatre, they would show it on New Year's Eve, and everyone would go and see it. And it was the big, funny, hip thing to do, is to see the party and laugh your ass off. I never found it that particularly funny. The other representation that was so famous at Yellowface was in so-called Yellowfaces in Breakfast at Tiffany's, where Mickey Rooney plays the Asian landlord. And I actually asked him about that when I interviewed him, and he said, I didn't know that was controversial. He said, in the 90s, he said, I didn't know that. And he said, but, I just hope no one is offended by that. And I'm like, how could you not know? Everyone's been talking about it forever. Like, he was really a major loon. He was really a crazy person. But anyway.
Well, maybe he's just out of touch and not paying attention. I mean, like, I know apparently Woody Allen doesn't watch TV. He doesn't read the newspapers. He's blissfully out of touch with a lot of that stuff. So he doesn't. No,
Mickey Rooney did. Mickey Rooney gave me a whole riff on the media, including that Clint Eastwood was going to hell because he'd made Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, which had a drag character in it, a black drag character. So he was trans character. So he was offended by that and said, that Ellen meant we were all going to hell in a basket because Ellen was on TV. And, he was just was really all fired up about God and that sort of thing. So anyway, but it was a kick to interview Mickey Rooney, I got to say. I think he was probably he was really tired of gay journalists asking about Judy Garland. I think that's probably what was up his ass.
Yeah, I thought it was a fascinating moment, sort of where kind of narrative and political realities crossing was when Barack Obama said that his favorite show on TV was The Wire, and his favorite character was Omar on The Wire, right? And Omar was a very fascinating character to have. I mean, here's this incredibly violent, kind of hyper masculine character who's also incredibly tender and loving towards his boyfriend, and is just this weird. It went against a lot of stereotypes.
Yeah.
Like, big time. I mean, Omar's no hairdresser.
No.
He's not but it was interesting Barack Obama saying that.
I think it's really interesting to look at the popular culture that, political leaders are consuming. There's a great book called Nixon at the Movies, which talks about the films that he was interested in seeing and his reflections on them, and it's just fascinating to read that stuff.
I never read that.
Yeah, it's a great book. And
I read like sort of Hitler and Stalin's weird tastes in movies, but I didn't know about.
Yeah,
Nixon's.
Hitler loved King Kong, right? And M. Yeah, there were certain films that he loved. Yeah, I know they're really strange. Things that he really appreciated.
Wanted Western. Yeah,
I wonder why that would be. Yeah. So, that's very telling.
So Nixon was into
but the Nixon era is so rich in terms of popular culture. Because on television you had All in the Family, which was just the family screaming at each other about what was going on, right down to every election. And then I teach Dirty Harry. I mean, that's a really interesting film.
So what's your take on Dirty Harry?
Well, it's the obvious one. I mean, I just think Pauline Kael called it, this is fascism, right? And then there was all this sort of blowback. But the thing about it, what's really fascinating is that it was really, the screenplay was a direct response to the Miranda decision, right? Which says, well, you have to treat a prisoner a certain way when you arrest them. You can't just do whatever you want. You can't torture them. You have to get a lawyer for them and blah, 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 and read them their rights. And so the screenplay is really a response to that. And what's really interesting is the way it shaped people's perceptions of Law and Order. I mean, it still does. I mean, the fact that Clint Eastwood was like the most famous guest speaker at the Republican National Convention 5 years ago. I mean, it's still very much a part of the way people see Law and Order, Crime and Punishment. And, Reagan quoted him, Make My Day, in one of the subsequent sequels. He says, Make My Day. So Reagan actually quoted him.
What do you think the connection between Dirty Harry and Watergate is? This is something that's always kind of puzzled me. I mean, in terms of I don't know, I'm just throwing this out there, but it seemed to me that there's some relationship between the attraction of that movie and the idea that people trying to come to terms with the fact that the Law and Order candidate broke the law flagrantly, and sort of trying to sort of rationalize that, look, in a broken system, sometimes you need a thug to get things done, which, of course, as you said, is fascism's argument all the time. And so, I mean, do you think there's a connection there?
Absolutely, because if anything, Watergate just shone a light on the hypocrisy of Law and Order unless you're the president, and then we're obviously seeing echoes of that now, which is that Trump's lawyers saying, well, and his people saying, well, he can't have broken the law because he's the president, so he is the law, right? So he can just do whatever. He's just totally attacking like a tin pot dictator, and I think it's interesting as it relates. It's very interesting as it relates to Nixon. Nixon was still popular among a lot of Republicans, but he knew, because I think the Democrats are taking control of Congress by that point, and I think that he knew that there would be impeachment hearings. So he actually realized that he'd done something wrong, which I don't think Trump will ever admit to that. And so Nixon knew that he had to go. So there were no impeachment hearings. He resigned under threat of it. So I think that's a really telling moment. At least it's somebody who was really awful, but he sort of kind of knew he'd done something bad, knew that there was going to be comeuppance. Whereas Trump, who is so similar to him in certain ways, the paranoia and everything else, and the list of enemies and hating the media, hating Hollywood, I don't think he just thinks he's completely above anything.
Yeah, I don't know. He seems to me like somebody who's just doesn't spend too much time kind of second guessing himself, right? And I say that, there's a way to hear that in a judgmental way, but I don't exactly mean it in a judgmental way. I just mean that he just seems like one of these people that's very emotional, like a very emotional person. And I've known people like this who are delightful, actually, because if your instincts are really kind and generous and sweet, then, there's people like that are wonderful. I mean, they're spontaneously warm and generous and open and kind. And so he seems to me like somebody who's just a very emotional person. He just goes with what he feels, and he doesn't second guess it very much at all. And unfortunately, what is in his soul is not all kind. It's not, a lot of it is pretty, as you say, resentful. And he seems like one of these people, and I like your comparison to Nixon, because there is this, you almost need Nietzsche to understand, like Nixon and Trump, that there's this sense that they can conquer the world, and yet they still feel like the underdog. They still feel like they are potentially under threat all the time. There's still this chip on their shoulder, like, you think you're better than me? You think you're better than me? It's like, how can you still think of yourself as the underdog when you're president of the United States? You won.
Well, that's someone put it very well. A commentator said, there are poor losers and then there are there are sore winners, right? It's like you guys
my
won, and
mom
you're
used
still
to say
going
that
on
all the time when I was
going
growing
on
up.
and on and
Yeah.
on about basically like your victims, and now they've
Like
created.
Fox News, right? They've been the biggest news station for 16 years, but they're still the underdog that's
and they're
against
still
the mainstream
and they're still
media?
talking about the mainstream media. Exactly, you are the
You
mainstream.
are the mainstream
the
media.
mainstream.
Would you just own it?
Yeah, but now there's this other narrative that Fox has created, of the deep state. So there's like this idea that there are people, operatives at the FBI and CIA, who are still loyal to Obama and Hillary and the Democrats, who are intentionally trying to sabotage everything that Trump does. So if anything goes wrong, he can just switch gears to that other narrative and say, well, I'm really the victim in all of this. And it's just incredible to me that anyone believes anything he says, but people are doing it. It's just not that shocking anymore, really. People obviously kind of want true lies. They want to buy in. Speaking of another movie, they want to buy into the true lies, right? They know that they know. I mean, Shania Twain just got into trouble because she said, well, at least he's honest. So he's honest about the fact that he's constantly lying. And the big defense when people say that he's lying, like Meghan McCain will always go to this de facto position, which is, well, all politicians lie. So it's almost like at least he's upfront about his lying, right?
Yeah. I just finished listening to this podcast called Slow Burn, which is all on, have you
Watergate.
Listened to it? It's all on Watergate.
Mm-hmm.
It's just fascinating, but the parallels are astounding. And in fact, there was I'm blanking on his name, but there was a journalist in the middle of the whole Watergate situation who published this sort of satirical list of the ways in which a Nixon supporter deflects attention from Watergate. And it's almost word for word what you hear now with the whole Russia investigation. And it's sort of, if this, then say this. If this is like the Jesuits telling you how to argue, theology. So if this, and one of them was, if you are cornered and it seems like it's true, then say, well, everybody does it. They just got caught for doing what everybody does. Everybody's doing it. Why can't we? Right? It's it's a kind of a cynicism that's very dangerous. And one of the things to return to what we were talking about just a while ago is it's a cynicism that actually I had to some extent inculcated in me when I was at Concordia in the 90s, because that was like the fashionable thing, this sort of Adbusters reading, Kaylee Lazen type. It was this incredible cynicism which now has actually undermined faith in democratic institutions and voting. We were told all the time, I had like blue hair and at the time, and we were told voting was just a scam and it's all a rigged system. And these ideas have really gone to some dark places. And
absolutely.
I mean, I don't know. And people who are still arguing that now, I find I have less and less patience for them on the left who are still saying that. Like, can you still say that truth doesn't matter and voting doesn't matter? Like now, really?
Yeah, I remember the rift in grad school. I mean, there were the Chomsky followers who said, well, this has real ramifications, the neo-Marxists. And then the postmodernists were always quoting Foucault, and there will always be an oppressor no matter what. And I don't know. It was pretty nihilistic, the postmodernists. I mean, they better parties, so I went to their parties, but they were more fun.
They really did.
Yeah, they were. The lines of coke were flowing, but I didn't ever really agree with that, and I was one of those sort of evil people who said, well, a centrist is better than a right-wing politician, and advocated strategic voting and all the rest of it, and is still getting called a neoliberal whore because I said, well, better get out and vote for Hillary. I'm with Fran Lebowitz. Just get out there.
Yeah,
she's my favorite person right now because if it's not her, it's Trump. So just get out and vote for her, you fools.
Yeah, we had actually Kimberly Manning on the podcast recently, who's running for the Liberal Party, and she's taken a fair amount of heat from this because she's the head of the Simone de Beauvoir Institute at Concordia. She's a political scientist. She's also been a real trans activist. She has a trans daughter who I actually have known for a long time. She was in my day camp that my wife and I ran for quite a while. And she came on and so one of the first questions I asked her, I said, Kimberly, what the fuck? Like, you're running for the Liberals. Why not the NDP? And I said, the stats are that there's been a real shift in North America in academia. If you were to go back to, let's say, 1990, the political orientation of people like professors was, definitely it was more towards the left for sure, but there was actually quite a balance, right? There's been a massive shift, and there's a number of reasons for this, but there's been a massive shift just in the last 20 years, 25 years. So now, right now, over 90% of Canadian academics voted NDP in the last election. And basically academia has become sort of, are you center left to far left, right? And there's practically no conservative voices, or even centrists are sort of embarrassed, right, in most departments now. So I asked her, I said, like, why in this context, as a professor, you're heading the War Institute, the most radical institute at Concordia. And her response was, this Liberal government is the most progressive government that we've had in Canada in 40 years. What do you think of that? Do you buy that?
Well, I think certainly I've been following the pipeline misery the last week or two, and it's been very odd. And actually, my take on that was that there was a kind of genius to what Justin Trudeau was doing, and that is saying, I support the pipeline, so that he could keep his support in Alberta, which he does have some support there in the West, which is pretty amazing because his last name is Trudeau. And knowing that the pipelines are just going to fail. I mean, unless oil is $100 a barrel, they just don't make much sense to invest billions of dollars in building them. So I think his sense was that it was going to that these projects, they already were falling apart, right? They were being canceled by corporations. That's why I'm a little surprised to see him really digging his feet in and actually pledging taxpayer dollars to Kinder Morgan project, which is really, really, really a bad idea. Excuse me. But there are so many other things when Jesse Brown says in the New York Times op-ed piece that, frankly, there's really very little difference between the previous Conservative government Liberals. He couldn't be more wrong.
That was a vicious op-ed.
That was a very strange, but that paragraph was just so odd because, I listed on social media just a few of the stark differences, the attitudes towards science and information, which is really, really important. We have some of the best statistics kept in Canada around the world. We're notorious for them and famous for them. And we need that statistical evidence so that we can act on data and the truth and the facts. Yeah. And the government was doing its best to unravel those things in the same way that Trump is doing now in America. The attitude towards refugees and immigrants obviously is hugely different. The attitude towards LGBTQ rights. They passed protection for trans people. That's really important. They've done some really important things. The fact that half the cabinet are women, and I keep hearing people saying, I hear some people cynically say, well, that's just a kind of boutique feminism, but it's not. The cabinet minister holds obviously some power over their portfolio. They're not just figureheads, and the women who've been appointed.
That issue has always
eminently
that
qualified.
whole discussion has seemed to me almost completely besides the point.
That shows a political will, and it was the Liberals before. It was under Jean Chrétien that we had the first perfectly gender balanced Supreme Court in the world. So equal number of male and female judges. That's not just symbolism. That's extremely important that we have courts and political representation that reflects the population. Women are still too often undervalued.
What about meritocratic? Why shouldn't everything just be meritocratic?
I know that was, and people were making those statements, but now they see how qualified the cabinet ministers are generally, by and large. We're having people trip up every now and then, but no worse than any other government or better than any other government. No, I think that's extremely important. So why do you think it's important? Because I'm very fascinated by this because I think it's important, but whenever I've explained my rationale, people are looking at me like I have three heads. But I'm curious, why do you think it's important to have a gender equal cabinet? Well, because for women to look at government and see no women at the table when decisions are being made. For example, there's sort of famous photographs where an all-male group of older men are signing a bill that affects women's reproductive rights. That's just absurd, and people can see it's absurd. It feeds into cynicism about democracy generally, and it kind of it's kind of Handmaid's Tale-y, you know? So I think that it's really important that we have more women represented in government. Now, it's going to sound like vulgar essentialism. Some people have put forth the argument that women do reach compromise in a way that is different than the way men do. The compromises that have happened in Congress in the last 5 to 10 years, apparently a lot of them have been brought about by women's Congress, a caucus within Congress, that a lot of women are better at reaching across lines and less polarizing, so they can work together to talk about how issues affect them. So I think that's really important. Obviously, women are just going to have a bit of a different perspective on things like childcare. We also see women are usually a lot less reluctant to support initiatives around military intervention and war. So we see certain issues where women seem to react.
Thatcher seemed to be pretty fine with it.
Thatcher did. Gandhi. I mean, people always bring up Thatcher. You know, there's a few, and there's Sarah Palin. I mean, there's nut jobs around who are obviously. It isn't to say that necessarily that women are better, but women do have different ways of looking at things. I just think it's really important that government be represented. I mean, it just seems obvious to me. I know that some people are very cynical about diversity because the word gets bandied about so much now, right?
Oh, well, there's ways in which it can be implemented which are, terrible, right? And I definitely think you want to have competent people in power, and you want to give, if you have important responsibilities. But the thing is, there's so many competent people to choose from that if you decide, okay, well, let's just go with like a woman in this case, or let's just go with somebody, then you're not really compromising quality because you had 100 people that were amazing, qualified. But for me, actually, the issue, and I'd be interested to hear like what you think of this, but for me, the issue is actually fundamentally has nothing to do with multiculturalism or feminism necessarily, or diversity. For me, it comes to the heart of political legitimacy. Right? When the Roman Empire was expanding, they were very, very careful to have people who were senators, people in the military, who were they did not have this conception at all, but people that were from Africa, from North Africa, people who were from Germania, people with blonde hair and blue eyes. They made sure that it wasn't just nothing but ethnically, Italian peninsula folk that were running things, because they understood that if we're going to be managing a large empire, we have to have legitimacy in the places where we are. And if they see this as just a foreign occupation and that their needs are not being recognized, then we're going to have rebellions, which is not good because it's a pain in the ass to have to deal with them, right? So I see when you have big nation states like the United States or Canada, from their inception, for people to say that this is something new is, either they're lying or they're just really ignorant of history, because from the beginning, for instance, in Canada, this was kind of English, French, and so they were very, very careful to make sure there were French names in the cabinet, and nobody would ever have nothing but English names in the cabinet. You would take people, and what is that? That's exactly like going for diversity, right? And in the United States, the reason why all the way, even to the present day to some extent, they would have Southerners were way overrepresented as presidents and, in cabinets, because they really wanted to maintain a North-South balance, right? Now, obviously, slavery was totally evil, and it's good that it was gone, but it's instructive, I think, to look at why the South broke away from the Union. They broke away from the Union because Lincoln could be elected in 1860 without even running in the South. He wasn't even on the ticket. And that sent a very clear message to them that, we can win without even paying attention to you. Right?
Yeah.
So when I see Trudeau going to the West and favoring pipelines, I don't think he has any illusions about ever being elected by those people. I think he's actually thinking more in terms of the good of the nation state, that I need to let them know that I'm their prime minister too, right? And so I think in having a gender balanced cabinet, what he's saying is, this is your government too, to half the population of Canada, saying this is your government. Do you understand? It's an issue of like legitimacy. Like, how do you, because if you saw this with the Bloc Québécois, if any part of the nation state gets the sense that they are completely being ignored and that they don't matter to the federal government, then why should we stay?
Absolutely. And I think I actually really think for all the problems that this government is happening and there are bumps, I think that within people's Facebook friend list, within their Twitter feed, there's an outcry over the pipelines. But when you look at the polling data, it shows that a lot of Canadians actually buy into the Liberals' line about it. So it's I think this government can weather a lot of these storms, and I would say probably they would be headed into another majority in the next election. That's my prediction. I think that I think Jagmeet Singh is really a great guy and a really interesting choice, and I'm glad he got in. But there was something to be said for the critics who said, well, he's not in Parliament, so he's not there, right? So somebody like Mulcair is having to get up and be fierce in Parliament and be ferocious and to be the attack dog in Parliament. You need a presence in Parliament. I think that's hurting Singh. And the other thing is, to be perfectly blunt, I think that while there are some red meat eating conservative Canadians, most Canadians look at what Trump is doing and recoil in horror. And if the Liberals can safely attach Scheer to a kind of Trump populism, I think that will hurt Scheer. So I think that it's a little bit like Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. There's just this fear of really rabid Republicans. Canadians didn't like Nixon. Canadians didn't particularly like Reagan. Canadians were really against the invasion of Iraq when 70% of Americans were saying we have to do it. So I think that there is something in the water here that just shifts that. So for all, I'm disturbed by the pipelines too, like a lot of people. But I think probably, and I'm not even sure I'm going to vote for him. I voted for Mulcair in the last election because he was my local candidate and he stood the best chance of winning over Conservatives. So I voted for him, and I think he did. I think he did a good job. Yeah. So I may
actually in the next election, and I can't believe if my mother's hearing this, she may be very mad at me. But I may, for the first time in my entire life, vote Liberal in the next election. I've voted NDP or Bloc Québécois or for separation, but I was one of those Anglophones that voted yes in the referendum. But I may actually vote Liberal because I'm not really crazy about Singh. I think he's very good looking. If he's going to compete with Trudeau in style, he's maybe got a little bit of an edge on Trudeau. They're both very sort of magazine cover ready, but yeah, he there's quite a few of his positions that trouble me. I mean, I really am weirded out by the fact that he will not acknowledge that the biggest terrorist attack in Canadian history, he won't acknowledge who did it. That's weird. I mean, that's, like if a politician gets up and says, chemtrails are real, or I question evolution, his take on Flight 182 is in the same category for me. It's a deal breaker. It's like something where if you say this, I shut off, right?
People said he was being held to a double standard, and I understand that criticism. At the same time, if I was one of his handlers, I would have advised him to handle it entirely differently. You immediately denounce it, and you denounce the group that did it, and you make it really clear right from the get-go.
Like Obama did with his pastor. Right? Yeah. His pastor has some sort of very radical views, and he just immediately said, hey, I love this guy. He's an amazing pastor. I've profited from his wisdom a great deal over the years, but on this issue, we have never seen eye to eye, and I think he's dead wrong. Yeah, it was so elegant. It wasn't mean. Yeah, it wasn't bitchy.
You need to get ahead of that story right away.
He just put that fire out before it started. I mean, and Singh hasn't, which is very odd.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, again, it's hard to assess where he's at because I don't see him when Parliament is debating, and I think that some people were bringing that up and it got dismissed and he won, but I think that really is kind of hampering. You need that visibility in Parliament, right? So
Kimberly's actually running for his seat, so if she wins, it would be a Liberal taking not just an NDP seat, the NDP seat. Like
she's running where?
It's the big riding that includes kind of Côte-des-Neiges, Plateau, Miland. It's like this big monster riding Yeah.
Oh,
it's
so
like
so Singh is running here.
no, he's running in a different one, but Montclair is stepping down.
Montclair,
and so they're going to have to
okay.
go into a by-election for that seat, and she's running for that. So if a Liberal wins Montclair's seat, that's going to be I think a big wake-up call to the NDP.
But it was unusual that Montclair won, right? That was usually traditionally a Liberal seat, so it was rare. It was unusual that an NDP won that seat. So we'll see. But you're right; she's probably got a good chance.
It's freaky. A lot of people say that we're living right now in a time of sort of reaction, that things are moving rightward in many places. I wonder, why do you think that when it comes to sort of gay and lesbian issues, it seems to be one of the few things that is not being rolled back? Obviously, Russia is an exception, but like in a lot of countries that have been having a right turn, you don't see any rollback of sort of gay rights. And I'm wondering, what do you think is going on with that? Like environmental rights are going way back.
Yeah, that's true. Well, I think there's been enough of an advance that they know that would probably be unpopular with a lot of people. But make no mistake, this is a big part of the battleground. I mean, Trump's support among evangelicals has gone up, even despite these scandals. And we know what Mike Pence wants. I mean, he doesn't want any more. And if they could, they would just simply try to reverse the same-sex marriage decisions and start taking licenses away, or at least stop issuing them, and put a halt to issuing them. They'll try to do that in the next few years. And of course, trans people are paying, right? So there's a rollback on their rights, and the Trump administration's been really clear that they're not going to expand any of that and try to reverse the executive orders and stop trans people from serving in the military. And the courts are doing their best. I mean, the courts are doing some pushback, but so it's hard to say. I mean, I'm torn. On the one hand, some people say, well, the Trump thing, it hasn't been quite as bad as everyone expected. So perhaps we were overreacting when we first learned that he got elected. But other people are saying, well, we're kind of being lulled into a sense of complacency. I
don't see a lot of complacency.
No,
people are pretty fired up.
My two main concerns are obviously another 9/11, something like that would then give Trump. Would allow him to justify doing whatever the hell he wants, which is, I think, something that really does make me makes me lose sleep, because that's really, he's just not the person to have in charge. And he's, replaced the people who were, the people who look kind of sane, who normally I would say are completely insane, but the people around him who look sort of relatively reasonable people, he just got rid of, and has got Bolton by his side now. Somebody who said all sorts of incendiary things about using the bomb and so on and so forth. And of course, the other thing that worries me is that basically all of this rampant deregulation is he's putting everything in place to have the exact kind of meltdown we had 10 years ago. And if he's running the economy when it goes over a cliff, imagine, he's not going to know what to do. He's not. He's not. Apparently, he's probably worth just a few million. He's not even a billionaire. I mean, the media ran with this line that he was a billionaire because he said so. But we haven't seen his tax returns. Where is tax returns?
In Game of Thrones, there's that one character. He's in the city, and he's the richest man in the city. He's like really tall, like black guy, always incredibly well dressed, and he has a huge house. And he's trying to like woo Daenerys Targaryen to marry him. And then there's that amazing scene where she shows up with a bunch of Dothraki like warriors, and they force him to open up the vault. And it turns out he has no money. You ever that scene? Like I saw that scene and I immediately thought, this is why Trump is so desperately not wanting to like release his tax returns and stuff like that. Is because if they opened up the vault, they would see there's nothing but debt in there that he probably doesn't actually have.
I think there's that, and I think that he's also interesting. We talked about Nixon, but he's interesting as a sort of also a strange reflection of Reagan, in that Reagan was the first president who'd been a member of both parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, similar to Trump. And Andrew Breitbart, the founder of Breitbart, who's deceased for a few years now, he actually said, he warned his readers and warned other people in the Republican Party, do not trust Donald Trump. Don't make him our leader. He was just praising Pelosi. The Clintons were guests at his wedding. Do not trust him. He's not one of us, right? Mm-hmm. He's slippery. So his slipperiness seems to have some appeal to people, but as we see with Nixon, if you make enough enemies, Nixon was disliked enough in the party that could also lead to a very quick, stabbing in the back of Trump. We'll see. I think he'll probably serve out at least his first term. And I think, God, there's no way they could reelect him, but they reelected Bush, and I thought that was crazy too. So they reelected Nixon. So Americans do all sorts of sordid things politically. So there's no telling what could happen. I mean, we could be in for a really nasty 8-year run.
Yeah, it's funny because James Comey at the end of his book, after sort of trashing Trump and saying all the ways in which he thinks he's terrible, he very, very clearly says, I think it would be terrible if we impeached Trump. I think the American voters, that would be letting them off the hook for electing this guy. And Comey says, actually, no, the American voters need to vote him out. They should not, impeaching him is allowing them to sort of get away with this, and it's also allowing his supporters to have a ready-made kind of conspiracy theory, right? That the deep state took us down or something like that, right? Which is an interesting take on it, right? But I just circle back to something else. You sort of made your reputation on writing on film criticism, but a lot of people say right now that I agree with this, that we're living in the golden age of television, and that one of the reasons why. And my friends who are novelists, I'm sorry if I'm insulting you right now, but one of the reasons why a lot of people think that novel fiction right now is not, there's some nice stuff out there, but for the most part, it's not great. And the argument I always hear is because all of the really great writers are writing for Netflix and HBO, that this has depleted the quality of written fiction. This has depleted even movies, like film scripts. So, I mean, to what extent have you shifted your focus more to television, or do you still focus on movies?
Oh, that's absolutely true. I mean, everything you just said, and I definitely, if somebody said to me, would you rather watch Big Little Lies again, or would you rather watch The Shape of Water again? I would take Big Little Lies in an instant, right? I just think that the television writing has gotten,
it's just unbelievable.
It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
There's so much good stuff on television now. It's and it really is hard to impress upon my students because they've grown up. They're obviously, in their early 20s now, a lot of them, just how seismic a shift that is. Because I mean, you remember when we were kids, when I was a kid, I mean, we
were kids at the same time.
Yeah, people said, oh, you're younger than I am, but people said, I think it was Mordecai Richler who said it's fitting that television is called a medium because it could never be very good. And, it was just, if you ended up on television as an actor, you were on your way down. Yeah. Probably. Or maybe on your way up or on your way down. This was something you were doing as a pension. Mm-hmm. And now it's just like night and day, And one of the things that I really appreciate about it is it's great to watch a lot of the shows. But I think something that's come with that shift, and it's a really important one, is that for many years, for decades, if you were a woman of a certain age, you were just put out to pasture, like Faye Dunaway. Even Jane Fonda, who had her own production company, had difficulty in her 40s keeping her career maintained. And what I really love about all of this great television is that, like Homeland and American Horror Story and all these shows, much richer writing for women characters and allowing women who are middle-aged and older to have good parts. And that is something I really appreciate about a lot of this. Big Little Lies is a great example. And that was Reese Witherspoon and Nicole Kidman saying, look, this book is really good, and let's hire a good director, Jean-Marc Vallée, let's get this going. We've got the star power. We can make this happen. And it's just really, really, really powerful with great feminist theme, but not poorly written, really well written. The kind of thing you want to see, that you really want to see and see again. So that's something that I think I really celebrate in that shift. And it's, everyone says, oh, there's always the Golden Globe Oscars thing. And a lot of the reason why the Golden Globes is more interesting is because it includes television. So people want to see who's going to get the TV awards, right? And the Oscars doesn't do that. So film has become, and sadly, become a lot less. I mean, there were good films this past year, but it's a lot less interesting.
Yeah, I think it's part of it is just a function of time, right? So you, one of the most annoying, I'm peevish, but I have like a long list that I've compiled over the years. It's up to like 130 now, but of sort of most annoying expressions in the English language. And one of my most annoying expressions is the book is better than the movie. I've always hated that. And the reason, my objection to it always was, the author has your attention for 17 hours, 20 hours, whereas the screenwriter has your attention for an hour and a half. Right. So obviously they have to compress this story a great deal, simplify a lot of things, reduce things to sort of formulas. But what's fascinating about TV right now is that you can have the 17 hours. So you have the audience's attention for as long as the novelist had your attention. And so now it's a fair fight. And what's fascinating to me is that the TV wins most of the time. I mean, the most obvious example is Game of Thrones, right? I've read all of the novels, and the novels are fun. They're great. The show is better written. It's actually better. The screen, in every respect, the characters are more interesting. If you just listen without even watching the show, just listen to the dialogue, it's better than the book. So now you can actually say with a straight face, the show is better than the book.
Yeah.
Which,
Well, I mean, there's all that debate about adaptation, and for a long time, it just felt like, well, a crummy book makes a great movie, like Jaws or something, But I think that that's an interesting reflection on that show in particular. And I think something that I find really interesting in terms of adaptation is a novel, like a dystopic novel like The Handmaid's Tale, and what they've done to it, how they've updated it for current times. And I think that's really, really, really fascinating.
Yeah, they've made it much more sort of plausible as something that could happen now, right? Margaret Atwood's novel is fantastic, but there's ways even at the time where I think there's some parts that just didn't ring true. It seemed a little too fantastic. Whereas now, because they're producing it in real time in these times, they can set it up in a way where it's entirely plausible that this could happen.
Yeah, and also, the update of Westworld, now from the movie to the TV series, it's like so much more plausible because of everything that's happening with AI and robots. So it's even. I really preferred the original, but the remake of RoboCop, the first 10 minutes is really chilling. It's basically about a RoboCop being sent into the Middle East and trying to determine who's a terrorist and who they're going to shoot. And that's just completely where we're at. It's basically, we're almost there. And so I find that really, really fascinating.
Okay. Yeah. And sort of the last question I wanted to ask you was, what is it like to teach film? To teach, like, as film being your text, right? Rather than kind of novels or textbooks, or to have films as your text. What is that like?
Well, it's
I've never done it. So
okay, well, yeah. It's a really fantastic gift. Usually it's really, really fun because if the students are on board, and I'd hard to imagine they're bored when I'm showing them such great movies, but it's I've
read your reviews. They love you and they say you swear a lot.
Oh dear, oh no.
Well, I'm going to out you right now, Sebastian. Sebastian, the producer of this podcast, actually took a class with Professor Hayes. Good. He's very good.
What was the class you took?
It was the documentary class, minority.
Okay, minority representation.
Yeah.
I just taught that again. That was a fun class to teach. I designed that one myself, so that was good. No, it's a great gift, and I feel very lucky. And generally, the students are, if they're intrigued, if you're showing a student something that they've never seen before, and you're really turning them on to something that can feel really, really just fun. I start in May teaching a horror film class I've taught every year, every spring at Concordia. For this must be the 8th or 9th year I've done it, and I just really enjoyed. I love the genre, and I love just picking apart the movies with the students. And a lot of the students, nicest thing is someone will say after a screening or after a class, will just come up and say, "I didn't even know that film existed. Thank you for showing it to me, because it's really altered my sense of where a movie could go, or it's really fascinating." So that it's a very rich medium that way. It's a lot of fun to teach.
Have you have you transitioned at all, or do you intend to transition at all into covering some of these sort of amazing TV shows?
Yeah, I mean, in communication studies, when I've taught basic writing for the media, I've showed television, like the classic sitcoms like Mary Tyler Moore and All in the Family. I've shown them to pick apart how shows were political back then. Interestingly, they all relate to Archie Bunker. They all see him as an archetype less than they do Mary Richards. And I've certainly shown clips of The Sopranos and The Wire. Is when you look at mafia representations, then you definitely look at The Sopranos. And the other thing that I talk about with The Sopranos, because many of them have seen it, some haven't, but many have, is that when I tell a little anecdote, when I heard they were doing The Sopranos, the show, and I heard what it was about, I was like, well, I'm just not even going to bother watching it, because Coppola and Scorsese have said everything that you could say about a mob family. I don't need to see it. And I was just so dead wrong. I mean, it shows that you can always bring even to material that might seem stale. And of course, the genius of that show is like this domestic setting, right? This family and all the issues that a family faces, but they're in the mob. I mean, I just thought it was so brilliant and simple in a way, but really clever, right? So yeah, you have to talk about it, and you have to.
They should have ended it like a couple seasons before they did, though. It got really washed out.
You felt?
If they had done sort of, for instance, the obvious comparison for me is with 6 Feet Under. I mean, 6 Feet Under did everything that they could do with the characters, and they did it, beautifully. And then when they were done, they just rode off into the sunset and, left on a really, really high note. They didn't overplay their hand, whereas I feel like Sopranos really overplayed their hand, and it got very washed out and became kind of a parody of itself towards the end. It was annoying.
It did. It was always a very self-conscious show, right? Like episode 1 had the Scorsese cameo, right? And many of the cast of The Sopranos of Goodfellas were in it.
Yeah.
So, but no, it's funny. I think one of the things I thought the final episode was very gutsy, but the second to last episode, I couldn't really breathe while I was watching. It was when they were like pulling guns out of the ceiling and they were on the lam, and the whole episode is them just fleeing, right? Yeah. They know they're marked. Yeah. And I thought second to last episode, I mean, I had bad dreams after the night I watched it. I mean, it was like, it really impacted me.
Yeah, that was good. That one was good.
Yeah, no, there were ones that were, and then I thought that there was a really crushing one with the character who's gay and just goes to the nightclub, and then the guys are making a delivery and they see him. And so then he's marked, right? I mean, like, there were these subplots that were really the way that the show could digress and show us one character for an episode or two, and then something would be off, or something we'd never see them again. I thought that's one of the great things.
So you show some of that stuff, because I remember at Harvard, William Julius Wilson, very scandalous move. He decided in his sort of race and American culture class to not assign any text, any textbooks, any books. He had them just watch The Wire, and that was their text, was The Wire. And they would and he would give these really, really long. And there were some people who thought, "What? This is really devaluing higher education. Like, you're just going to watch TV the whole time." And his point was like, "No, we're going to take this text very seriously, because it's actually a really well written and brilliant text.
Yeah.
Like, why do you think this is inferior to some monograph?"
Well, that's a very odd. The reaction to that is so odd. I mean, there were museums and art galleries that wouldn't show photography for well into the 20th century. I mean, there's always sort of resistance to these new media, and it's strange. I mean, people are teaching classes in analyses of video games, and I mean, there's all sorts of different things that we should be looking at. I mean, that was kind of the point of genre analysis and a lot of cultural studies, was to say, well, if it's popular, we should be looking at why it's popular, right? So, and pornography too, we should be looking at these tropes. When I did alternative journalism, we did a couple of classes in pornography, right? Documentaries about pornography and different takes on pornography. We have to talk about it. It's part of alternative press, so I thought that was an important thing to look at.
So, and do you find, I mean, in teaching on movies, because this is something that my friend Fred Bodie, professor at Concordia in the history department, and he teaches American film, and he's mentioned this to me, and I've heard this from other people as well. Do you find that that students sort of come into the class and expect it to be sort of easy, or do you think they come in with a good attitude or a bad, like they're willing to sort of look at these things as important texts, or?
Well, I think that's a good point. And I'm probably guilty at Marinopolis. I'm guilty of making it probably, as you my ratings on Rate My Instructor. I probably make it a little too easy. I'm aware that's a hyper competitive school, and that students are being pushed a lot of times. And there's a lot of pressure there for them. So I do make it, and there's a difference because they're taking it as an option. They may never go on and take another film class. So I'm just making the class as inviting and fun as I can. Okay. The teaching film at Concordia is a little bit different in that I'm teaching within a film school. So people have come specifically to study film as a discipline. So film studies. So then, I'm a bit of a communist. I just want everyone to have an A and have fun. So the thing is that what I have with my larger classes is I have the privilege and good luck and good fortune to have a TA who does the majority of the grading. I mean, I supervise it, but what that does is that kind of creates a kind of bad cop buffer for me, which I need, because I just tend to grade.
You'll just be like Lake Wobegon. The women are strong, the men are good looking, and all the children are above average.
I tend to, there's that. I tend to just grade too easily. So I kind of need a buffer that way.
A vice principal.
Something like that, a Principal Skinner. I need someone to help me, because I'm not very good at getting in touch with my inner fascist, and I just tend to want the class to be a good time. So, and I think that's important. It's important to be drawing the students into the material, but you have to draw the line somewhere. You can't just give everybody a good grade. I mean, people have to work for it and all the rest of it. I know all that baggage that I've got. So, but it definitely, it's different at the two institutions, right? Because, if you're teaching a 400 or 500 level seminar in communication studies, that's entirely different in terms of the level of theory and things that you're applying and throwing out.
And also,
at the students.
they're taking 2 or 3 classes in the semester, whereas with CEGEP students, they're taking maybe 7 or 8. So they're juggling a lot more balls. So you can't ask as much of them.
It's really a lot, and it's something we have to come back to at the college level and CEGEP level, is that we are putting the students under a lot of pressure, and I think it's something that comes up at meetings. We have to talk about how we're managing that and how we're making sure the students are, because they should be working hard, I know, but they're young. They should also be enjoying their education,
having fun.
I usually just try to impart upon them. I mean, I'm kind of a scam because I'm write about films, teach films for a living, so it's just ludicrous, really. I mean, someone's going to find out, they're going to take me out and shoot me in the town square because it's a scam. But the thing is that I try to impart upon them that I worked really hard so that I can do something I enjoy. There's a difference between having a career and a job. You want to do something that you can like, so, and you can have fun. So you can work really hard and still be having a good time. It's corny, but that's usually what I try to impart upon the students. Don't go into something if it's something your parents have told you should do or you feel like you should do because you're going to make money, if it makes you miserable. I know a lot of people with law degrees who walked away from law, practicing law because they didn't like it. So if you're going to go through all of that torture of going through school, it's a lot of work. You should try to figure out something that you really enjoy. That you really actually, where do you want to be in 10 years?
I got to tack on just one more question. We'll close with this, but what are you working on right now? Like, what are you writing right now? What are you working on? What are you excited about right now?
Well, Tom Waugh is my mentor who just retired last year this year at Concordia, film studies professor, and an amazing person, really incredibly well-published academic. He and I have had a book series we've been doing for 12 years called the Queer Film Classics. We've done about 18 titles. So our last book in the series, it is a finite series on Scorpio Rising, Kenneth Anger's landmark experimental film. We're editing that manuscript right now by an American academic called Robert Cagle, who's really a great guy and a wonderful writer. So we're very excited about that, but that's our last book in that title. And then I'm doing a Truth Be Told, Conversations with Documentary Filmmakers. That's my next book. But I'm also working on a horror screenplay with Noam Gonick. I've never done screenwriting before, so we're working on that. The Winnipeg-based queer filmmaker, we're working on that. And so I've got a few projects that I'm working on, but because of what's happened in journalism, which actually is really depressing, and it's kind of gone over a cliff.
I didn't ask you about that because I know it's such
we
a
could
sad,
go on
sad...
we go on for another hour, but there's
it's
not
been
enough,
very sad.
Yeah, but crying to my beer over that. But anyways, that's been a real drag that's happened. But what it's meant is that I've had to shift a lot of my focus onto more teaching. And so this last semester, for example, I had between the two, Marinopolis and Concordia, I had 5 classes. So that doesn't always leave me as much time as I would like for the writing, So I used to have a really good balance of writing and teaching, maybe 2-3 classes a week, and then I would write the rest of the time. So now it's if I have a couple articles on the go that I've got to do, then I'm usually pretty exhausted by the end of 2 weeks because I'm like, in every spare moment I have, I'm researching and writing when I'm not teaching. So that's the way it rolls.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. This was a real delight.
Thanks
and
for having me.
I would like to do this again in the future. Absolutely.
Sure.
So, yes, if you would like to support the Likeville podcast, please like us on iTunes. That's great. Please subscribe on iTunes. And also, share our podcast with your friends, even with your enemies. And also, if you'd like to support us financially, you can do so through Patreon. All right. Thank you very much. Take care. Bye for now.